On March 4, 1789, as the new federal government officially began in New York City, George Washington remained at Mount Vernon, far from any public celebration. The date that later generations treated as the dawn of the presidency passed for him in quiet, uneasy reflection. He rose to the familiar routines of plantation life, yet his correspondence revealed that his thoughts were fixed not on farming, but on the looming call to national service. In letters to trusted figures such as Henry Knox and Edward Rutledge, Washington described his feelings as anxious and painful. He wrote that he would rather stay at Mount Vernon, tending to his estate and enjoying private life, than return to the political stage. He stressed his age, declining health, and lack of desire for power. The tone of these letters clashed sharply with later portrayals of a confident, eager founding hero. When word arrived that the Electoral College had unanimously chosen him as the first president, Washington reacted with visible discomfort. Contemporaries later recalled his troubled expression and heavy silences as he weighed the decision. His surviving letters showed that he did not fear battle, which he had already faced, but the burden and scrutiny of civilian rule. The man, later mythologized as father of his country, first approached the presidency with reluctance, not enthusiasm. As the Revolutionary War drew to a close, unease spread through the Continental Army encamped at Newburgh, New York. Officers had waited months for back pay and pensions that Congress seemed unable or unwilling to provide. Anonymous letters circulated, hinting that the Army might use its strength to force a settlement. Some officers even spoke in private of a bolder step, placing power directly in the hands of the Army's revered commander, George Washington. Washington entered the tense officers' meeting on March 15, 1783, and delivered what became known as the Newburgh Address. He appealed to duty, honor, and the ideals for which they had fought, warning against endangering the fragile republic. Then he drew out a new pair of spectacles, remarking that he had grown gray in their service and now found himself growing blind. The disarming confession moved the room to tears and dissolved the near mutiny. In the months that followed, when an officer privately suggested that he seize power, Washington firmly rejected any hint of monarchy or military rule, insisting that authority remained with civilians and elected representatives. On December 23, 1783, he appeared before Congress in Annapolis and resigned his commission as commander-in-chief. By voluntarily surrendering military power, Washington demonstrated a consistent aversion to personal rule, even when many urged him to claim it. In 1784, George Washington stepped through the doors of Mount Vernon, determined to disappear into private life. The war had ended, his commission had been surrendered, and he returned to the familiar rhythms of a working plantation. Each morning he inspected fields of wheat, corn, and experimental crops, consulted ledgers with overseers, and studied weather and soil. The camera lingered on ledgers and maps, evidence of a mind still disciplined, but now turned toward the land. Letters piled onto his writing table from across the new republic. When he was not writing the estate, Washington answered inquiries about western lands, canals, and trade routes, while balancing the finances of a vast but cash-poor operation. Behind the quiet order of Mount Vernon, enslaved men, women, and children labored from dawn to dark. Washington's account books revealed how deeply his comfort depended on their bondage, a reality that increasingly troubled his private reflections. Amid these routines, the post-writer brought unsettling news. Reports described quarrels over state boundaries, tariffs that pitted neighbor against neighbor, and paper money schemes feeding runaway inflation. Shays' rebellion in Massachusetts especially alarmed him. In letters to James Madison and Henry Knox, he warned that the fabric of Union seemed fragile and that anarchy and confusion threatened. Though he insisted he wished never again for public office, he slowly feared that silence might be a form of abandonment. In early 1787, letters from across the states reached Mount Vernon, urging George Washington to attend a convention in Philadelphia. Congress had called delegates to revise the failing Articles of Confederation, but uncertainty hung over the plan. Washington's wartime fame made him an obvious choice, yet he hesitated. He had already retired twice from public life and feared that another political failure would permanently stain his hard-won reputation. Correspondence from the period revealed his inner conflict. Washington wrote of his longing for private life and his concern that the convention might end in discord or rejection. He worried that his very presence would appear to endorse a potentially doomed project. In contrast, James Madison and other advocates confided that, without Washington, the gathering might lack legitimacy and could even disintegrate, leaving the fragile Union to drift toward dissolution. Warnings about possible disunion, economic chaos, and unrest eventually persuaded Washington that his absence might be more dangerous than his participation. Reluctantly, he consented and traveled to Philadelphia in May 1787, greeted by public curiosity he had hoped to avoid. When the delegates assembled, they unanimously chose him to preside over the Constitutional Convention, casting him not as an eager politician, but as a leader drawn back into service against his own preference. By the late 1780s, as the Constitution emerged from Philadelphia and moved toward ratification, attention shifted to a single, uncomfortable question: who would actually lead this new experiment? For many Americans, the answer seemed obvious. George Washington, victor of the Revolutionary War, appeared the only figure broad enough to unite wary states behind a fragile federal system. Yet as public expectations surged, Washington himself grew increasingly uneasy, sensing danger rather than glory in the role being prepared for him. In private letters from 1788 and 1789, Washington described the impending presidency as an ocean of difficulties. He feared the office was vague and untested, every decision destined to harden into precedent. A single misstep, he warned, might poison the Republic's future. He worried critics would claim he had long plotted for a crown. Citing his age, declining health, and sincere wish for retirement at Mount Vernon, he insisted he lacked both ambition and appetite for such power. Correspondence with Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and other leaders revealed a quiet campaign to persuade him. They assured him that only his reputation could steady the new government and calm anti-federalist suspicion. Electors began to organize around his name, often without public fanfare. Washington pushed back, repeating his preference for private life and agricultural pursuits. Yet, as ratification spread, the momentum made refusal increasingly unthinkable, turning his likely election into a burden he felt compelled, not eager, to accept. In early 1789, word finally reached Mount Vernon that the Electoral College had unanimously chosen George Washington as the first president of the United States. He had anticipated the outcome, yet the confirmation still weighed heavily on him. On April 16th, his diary recorded his departure with the phrase that he left home with unfeigned reluctance. The entry revealed little flourish, only the quiet gravity of a man who believed he was surrendering his cherished retirement. As Washington's carriage moved north toward New York City, celebrations swept the countryside. Towns organized parades, local militias turned out to escort him, church bells rang and crowds cheered along dusty roads and crowded wharves. Triumphal arches rose over his path, symbols of popular hope and gratitude. Yet his private correspondence painted a starkly different picture. He confessed that he was much distressed and compared himself to a culprit who is going to the place of his execution. On April 30th, 1789, Washington stood on the balcony of Federal Hall, overlooking Wall Street, and took the presidential oath administered by Robert R. Livingston. The moment seemed triumphant to spectators, but his first inaugural address struck a more subdued tone. He spoke with visible reserve, emphasizing humility, uncertainty, and a sense of duty. He explained that he had sacrificed his desire for a quiet private life, accepting the presidency not out of ambition, but as an obligation owed to the new nation. When George Washington entered office in 1789, his old reluctance quietly shaped every move. Rather than treat the presidency as a throne, he treated it as an experiment. He created a cabinet that deliberately contained clashing visions, appointing Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson to argue out the nation's future within his administration. He rejected grandiose titles, insisting on Mr. President and modeling a head of state who appeared Republican, restrained, and consciously temporary. Washington's first term revolved around decisions that defined the presidency's limits. He accepted the Senate's right to reject some diplomatic appointments, even when it frustrated him, signaling that executive power would not run unchecked. As Hamilton's program unfolded, assumption of state debts, a national bank, excise taxes, Washington approved after careful deliberation. Yet he also encouraged open debate, treating disagreement as a safeguard against despotism rather than an insult to his authority. The Whiskey Rebellion in western Pennsylvania tested that philosophy. Washington called out militia forces to prove federal laws would be enforced, but he stopped short of mass executions or show trials, mindful of appearing tyrannical. In private letters, he worried that fierce partisanship around Hamilton and Jefferson and the savage attacks in partisan newspapers might tear apart the fragile republic. The presidency, for him, felt less like honor and more like an exhausting, permanent ordeal. As 1792 approached, George Washington again felt the familiar pull toward retirement. The man who had once hesitated to accept the presidency now quietly searched for a way out. In private correspondence, he asked James Madison to help prepare a valedictory address, a dignified explanation for declining a second term. His letters revealed fatigue, recurring illness, and a deep weariness with political conflict that clashed with his public image of steady composure. Advisors urged Washington to reconsider. They warned that war raged in Europe after the French Revolution and that rival factions at home were sharpening their attacks on the young federal government. They argued that only his reputation held the fragile Union together. Political opponents sometimes dismissed his retirement talk as a strategic ploy, yet his private correspondence showed no pretense. Friends and cabinet members appealed to his sense of duty, not ambition, to keep him in office. Reluctantly, Washington accepted a second term, viewing it as an obligation rather than a triumph. His presidency soon collided with turmoil abroad and at home. In 1793, he issued the Neutrality Proclamation, angering those who wanted open support for revolutionary France. The Jay Treaty with Britain followed, provoking denunciations, public meetings, and street protests. Surrounded by partisan fury, Washington did not cling to power. He endured it, counting the days until he could finally step away. By the mid-1790s, the weight of the presidency had pressed heavily on George Washington. He had already wished to retire after his first term, yet the fragile new republic seemed to hold him in place. Near the end of his second term, however, his resolve hardened. With the nation divided over treaties, debts, and the French Revolution, Washington quietly revived his plan to step down, determined that this time he would follow through. Washington turned again to Alexander Hamilton, who helped transform an earlier, unused draft into what became the farewell address of 1796. Drawing on Washington's lifetime of reluctant service, the document warned against permanent foreign alliances, urged Americans to resist the pull of faction and party, and insisted that Republican government depended on public virtue. Between the lines ran a clear message. No single leader, not even a revered war hero, was indispensable to the Republic. Even as some allies pleaded with him to run for a third term, fearing chaos or foreign interference, Washington refused. When his farewell address appeared in a Philadelphia newspaper, the country reacted with a mixture of anxiety and respect. For Washington, this moment completed a long-held purpose: to prove the presidency was not a lifetime office and that power could pass peacefully. His final retirement confirmed that his reluctance to accept authority matched his determination to relinquish it. In the final years of his life, George Washington at last settled into the retirement he had twice postponed. Back at Mount Vernon after 1797, he walked the fields, inspected crops, and worked to repair the estate's finances strained by years of public service. He revised management plans, adjusted crop rotations, and received a steady stream of visitors who came less to see a farmer than the former president who had stepped away from power. From his study, Washington followed national affairs through newspapers and correspondence, insisting he had withdrawn from politics. Yet the quasi-war crisis with France in 1798 briefly drew him back when John Adams named him commander of a provisional army. He accepted reluctantly, on the condition that others would handle daily command. At Mount Vernon, he also oversaw the gradual execution of his will, which ordered that those he enslaved be freed after Martha Washington's death. Contemporaries noted that Washington could have held power longer, yet repeatedly chose retirement, after the Revolution and again after 2 presidential terms. Later historians pointed to his departures as a model of Republican restraint. His example reinforced the expectation that presidents would serve only 2 terms, a custom later written into law by the 22nd Amendment. Washington's legacy thus rested not only on accepting the presidency, but on walking away when he could have stayed.